Salvete mi amici, mihi nomen est SD. Today I will be presenting some information you may find interesting about dragons. Now, this isn't meant to be all-inclusive, but I would like to point out real quick that when I refer to dragons, I also refer to like wyverns, worms, and drakes, etc. Now, when I say drake, I'm not referring to the pedophile rapper, but the reptile. So as you can see, I illustrated a couple different versions of what I'm talking about. This guy right here, he doesn't have any wings, but still a part of this situation. And then this one, he likes to walk on all fours. First bit of interesting information is the importance of claws. Now, claws are, to us, a very useful tool. We use them to carve stone and rock. It's kind of our claim to fame that we're able to pierce through stone. I also drew this misshapen rock right here, but essentially what we do is we will carve different stones and rocks into useful furniture or even just holes in the ground. We'll get gravel and dust out of it, which is used to cover up and protect eggs in those holes. We like flat, smooth ground for when we're digging into our holes. And we also like making nesting platforms by carving the rocks into smooth, elevated surfaces. It's important that we maintain the health of our claws as we use them in our daily lives. One bizarre thing that is not often brought up is our use of bowls. Now, occasionally you will have a singular dragon family that has their own family bowl. These bowls are incredibly important to us as it is used for holding and transferring water. So when we carve our basins into the ground and blow away all the dust, dirt, and debris to make it as clean as possible, we will empty our bowls of water that's been collected into it and then use the bowl themselves as the cover, which is why it's important that we are precise and actually make it so that our bowl is large enough to cover that hole we make in the ground. And that the hole's not too big, but it's also deep enough to hold enough water for us. And sometimes those decorative bowls will be used just as a cover for eggs. And for more hostile groups of dragons, they will also protect their eggs from one another by digging an extra large basin and then covering it with a protective bowl and then placing a nesting rock on top of that to cover and hide those eggs. Now, the water is collected by a specific group. We'll talk more about dragon rolls in a second. Now, when it comes to where dragons decide to live, you have to take into account various terrain issues, as well as natural resources nearby that you may need or want. Take, for example, foresty areas. Foresty areas may be more useful for finding game, but the rocky terrain and large boulders and mountainous areas are more useful for stonemasonry as well as making bowls and furniture and nesting platforms and whatnot. And then, of course, you need water. You need fresh bodies of water that you can collect water from, and they should be close by because water is obviously very important, regardless of what or where you are. Now, this would most likely be the most ideal sort of area. You have the den and hoard in this section right here. As you can see, it's a mountainous sort of terrain where we carve our caves out for various dens. And then you have two dragons right here just flying out into this area. Now, this area is far enough away from the den or hoard where it won't pose too much of a threat to have it there, given that you have a town nearby. It's actually ideal to have a town nearby, as many farms and farm towns will have livestock, which is not hunted for game, but is actually simply collected for their assets, like milk from cows or wool from sheep. There are actually certain animals that are considered not good to eat because they are more of an asset to be maintained than to be, butchered up. But also the benefit of being near town is that they are most likely going to be a town obsessed with mining for silver and gold in their mines. Having that nearby means that we can either mine ourselves or we can take it directly from the town. And let's just say when it comes to dragons, they can be very persuasive when it comes to the townsfolk and getting what they want from that town. Having a forest nearby, for various reasons mentioned earlier, but also just for wood, which is surprisingly useful, even though it's not as used. It's not used as much as like stone, but still useful. Having a wild area for game, as well as a large massive area for wild crops and wheat. And then a nice river that stretches along, that's far away enough from the town to collect water peacefully, and then bring it back to the den or hoard. So this would be the most ideal setup for placement for everything. If you are missing one or two of these factors, that's fine. As long as you have a nice body of water nearby, making a den in that area should be fine. This is where things get a little more complicated, mostly just a hierarchy sort of thing. When it comes to different positions that are filled by the dragons of each group, you have those in charge of crop, which is just harvesting or sometimes even growing closer nearby when you are not as close to wild crops. Mostly things like wheat, corn, potatoes, starches, and whatnot. These dragons are more so middle-ish class, if you want to consider it like that. Like, when it comes to the different classes, it's more so classes of respect rather than of wealth. Then you have the guard. They are in charge of protecting the entire group, really, making sure that there are no external threats trying to ruin their way of life. Now, I did draw a couple, just like a shield and an axe. We prefer weapons closer to this rather than traditional swords, as the swords that are taken from dragons, that are taken by dragons, they don't really fit in our hands that well. They're designed more for humans. That's why we traditionally will just cover our claws with some sort of, well, basically brass knuckles, but more likely just steel coverings and whatnot to protect our claws. And if we do use something like an axe, we will typically reinforce it with some sort of branch. One, so that it will fit nicer in our hands, and two, because we're more likely to break it by how we use these. We're pretty rough with our tools sometimes. Then you have stonemasonry as well as mining. They're the ones who will mine for gold as well as carving out caves for different family dens and single dens. Then you have the water collectors. They're the ones in charge of bringing water to the rest of the dragons and depositing them in their respective basins and then replacing the cover. Then you have the ones that work per assignment of the leader. This one is more so just any dragon in the group. They could already have a different job, but per assignment, they just do whatever the leader will tell them. Some of them are more like mercenaries, where they specialize in those assignments just based on what the leader requests most of the time. Then you have the entertainment and comforter dragons. They receive payment through comforting or entertaining the other dragons, whether on a personal level or as a group, and they are typically funded that way. They are funded quite handsomely, in fact, as it gets very boring up in those dens. Then you have the animal care as well as butchers. They are typically seen as very knowledgeable when it comes to anatomy as well as health and wellness of various animals. If you are sick, you would go to one of the butchers and they would help you out. Because we didn't typically have like doctors and whatnot. Now, they need to have a good knowledge of the animals and how to take care of them, because it is frowned upon to eat upon a sickened animal. If the animal is sick, it's not well, these dragons will take care of them, bring them back to health, and they never go for the young. They will always make sure that they've lived a full life first, because it's very frowned upon to end a life short. Basically, they need to produce the next generation first before they are taken in. They also will take care of the livestock and bring in stuff like milk and wool and all that stuff. Now, when it comes to the hierarchy of respect, the entertainment and comforter dragons, while they may be seen as the most valued, they are the lowest on the respect level because it's one of the easiest positions to fill. But they also are usually the highest paid. So typically the wealthiest will be the entertainers, but they are the lowest on the rung. On the next echelon, you probably will have the stonemasonry and mining, mostly because they just provide the gold that is exchanged and brought around. But they also make housing, so that is something to respect from them. Then you have the mercenaries. They work directly under the leader, which is the only reason they have so much respect as they do from the other dragons. Then you have the crop, which is kind of middle class a little bit. They're not really fantastic, but they're also not disrespected either. This is where I was. Then you have the animal care and butchers. They're the ones who provide, the meats and the medicine and as well as the other animal products, I guess you could say. They are just one rung above the crop tenders. Above them, you have the guard. They are the ones who directly put their lives on the line in order to protect the way of life of the other dragons in the tribe or town, or however they refer to themselves. And then the second highest respected is the water gatherers. They are the lowest paid, but they provide the most essential service. The reason I say they are the lowest paid is because you would never need to provide any sort of payment to receive the service that they provide. All you would do is you would walk up to one of the water gatherers, request water. They would get it for you as long as you gave them a bowl, and then they will come back with your water. And there is no exchange of money or anything like that, as it is seen as a basic need. Now, basic needs typically don't require, funding from any dragon's personal hoard. Sometimes they are group funded, like entertainment events, or sometimes the food. And the payment from the guard will typically come from the leader's direct den hoard, but not always. Sometimes it also just comes from contributions from other people or other dragons that are thankful for them and feel safer with them around. The highest respected position is the leader, obviously. And that'll actually bring me to my next page. This is where things get a little more complicated in terms of the leader. The leader chosen is chosen based on a few different things: being a good warrior, being very strong, and being well respected. That is how the Za is chosen. The Za is just a suffix that's added to the dragon's name as a title. And if there is no name for that dragon, like the dragon just doesn't have a name, the Za will choose a name. Like, for example, Dragosa or Sa Keosik, something along those lines. But the Za chooses the Zen, which is just their partner, essentially. Now, the Zen can be any dragon from any of those classes. There are no exceptions made because the Za is the most respected position. They can choose whoever they want as their partner. Doesn't necessarily have to be romantic. In most cases, it is, because that'd be kind of weird. You pick someone and say, this guy is second in command, but also, here's my girlfriend. Like, that'd be kind of weird. But yeah, they don't really care about gender or class or what the person does. It's exclusively the Za's choice, but the second in command is just the person who is in command when the top leader dragon is not there. Now, in most cases, the Za chosen is going to be a male dragon, and that's just because for a while a lot of those dragon tribes were a bit misogynistic. It is possible, and definitely happens quite often, where you will have a female Za. Gender didn't really matter, honestly. In fact, there are actually some groups of dragons who are solely female, and they will only bring in a male dragon to produce the next generation and then discard him. And that male dragon that comes in is essentially treated on the same level as an entertainment or comforter, where they are the lowest echelon of society, and only serve one purpose, and are compensated greatly. Luckily, after a while, they kind of shifted away from the very archaic nature of this, but then stopped doing any sort of groups altogether as a whole. Most of those groups no longer exist. They're mostly independent now, which is unfortunate, but in some cases for the better. Now, one of the most important aspects for dragons is the discussion of hoards. Now, some of this is a little bit of a stretch, but not by much. Based on what the dragons will choose to hoard is typically characteristic of that dragon's behavior and how they go on about their lives. Take, for example, the hoarding of items. Typically, if a dragon hoards items, they will be more interested in science and progress and more interested in appreciating the little things, and they will consider anything to be part of their hoard as long as it is theirs in their possession. An example of a dragon like this, me. I am one of these types of dragons. More invested in enlightenment than, gold or gems or silver. Which, don't get me wrong, all of these do appeal to dragons, but some more than others. Now, if you look at silver, silver hoarding typically has to do with ego and being focused on oneself. It can typically cause the dragons to look at their reflection quite a bit, both metaphorically and literally, as silver will reflect your own appearance, as you are without any sort of filter or anything. So, dragons that typically would hoard this, they're more aloof. They don't really hang around other groups. And I couldn't think of a great example for this other than maybe the Jabberwock, which many would say isn't even really a dragon, but that's why the Vorpal sword was the only thing that could kill it. Then you have gold, which is the most common for dragon hoards. Typically with these groups of dragons, they will be more focused on heat. They have really bad anger issues, and they like to fight a lot, and they want to be entertained. Now, one of the best examples I can think of this is Smaug, which is just from the Hobbit books. He wiped out entire cities and villages just so he could accumulate more and more gold. He didn't need it, obviously. Like, dragons don't need these things, even though it feels like a need. But yeah, he just surrounded himself with gold, like Scrooge McDuck or whatever his name was or whatever. But yeah, they typically will like to fight a lot for that gold, whether it's with each other or with towns or villages, typically more aggressive. And then you have gems and crystals. Now, gems and crystals, they go hand in hand, really, because to certain dragons, they're the same thing. As long as it's shiny and prismatic. But typically, these dragons are associated with mental distress and just being a bit paranoid. And the best example I can think of that is actually Seath. Originally, we thought Seath was more aligned with item hoarding, but really he was more so into crystals, which is why he resided in the crystal caves. He gave into crystal magic in order to become immortal, but he also became very deformed and distorted in his mind. Did lots of messed up stuff, but yeah, he's probably one of the best examples I could think of with hoarding gems. And this is actually something that a lot of dragons try to be careful of avoiding, is the hoarding of gems. silver and gold. Like, they're not great either, but the allure of these two is generally going to be harmless. But the allure of gems is much more dangerous, which is why Smaug, he mostly collected gold, even though he also collected gems. And that was just for his own sake. But anyway, these are the four main types of hordes. There are other types, of course, and they will speak a little bit on how the dragons will behave based on what they hoard. That's kind of how it is with any living thing, right? If you hoard something that is not good for you, you're probably not in a good mental state anyway. So be careful of this one, metaphorically and literally. I think that's all I have for this. Yep, sure is. I hope this was able to shed some light on dragon behavior, at least from the dragons I was around for my groups and different little villages I was part of. In fact, I did write a story years ago. Let me see if I can find it for you. Oh, I'm going to have to flip the camera. But anyway, this was a children's story I wrote a while back, years ago. I'm talking about this exactly. Now, I don't think I mentioned any other dragons in this story, but this was a demonstration of my being part of the crop gathering class. If you're curious and would like me to read you this story, although it is for kids, I can do that in the future if you'd like. Just let me know your thoughts. I hope this video was interesting. If you have any questions, I may compile them into a list and answer them in the future. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now, and walete miamiki.